Let's move on to more data types that we must learn about. The next one being booleans, which can hold only two values. One is true and another is false. Suppose you created a variable called is location enabled to check if location services are enabled for a certain device or not. Now you want to check conditions such as if location services are enabled for a certain device, then only check the current GPS location. And when it is false, then you just print an error message like this. Also, instead of explicitly mentioning equal to true, you can omit it and the compiler will understand that you want to check if this is true. For false, you can just add an exclamation mark at the beginning and you're done. Well, now let's move on to the next type, which is the list. It is similar to arrays and some other programming languages. Here, a list is basically just an ordered list of the same type or different types, like a list of books or a list of item prices. Let's try some examples in Dotpad. Here is a simple list that is initially assigned with a list of book names, like Harry Potter, Twilight, and some XYZ name. And we can simply print this and get the list in the console. But what is the data type that this list is supposed to store? If you want to check the runtime type of this list, you can just add booktitles.runtime type. And this shows that it is a chase array of dynamic, which is basically you can say that it's a list of dynamic. Dynamic simply means that this can hold a value of any data type. So if I go ahead and try to add a number into this list, suppose book titles dot add 2, this will not throw an error because this is allowed. Now, if you want to restrict a data type, meaning you only want string values to be added to a list, then you can simply write the concerned data type with an angle bracket here. So in this case, I can make it a string. Now the compiler will throw errors that a number is not allowed to be added to a list that allows only string. So as you can see here, the message says that the argument type int cannot be assigned to the parameter type string, which is correct because we have mentioned that it is only a list of string. This is because something called generics, and we will learn more about it in the later chapters. Similarly to previous data types, Dart also provides a number of methods to modify or manipulate a list, like finding the length of a declared list. So in this case, if I want to check the length of book titles, then I can do just book titles.length, and this should give me 3. Yes. And what if I want to clear out the list contents? So in this case, I can just do book titles spelling book titles dot clear, and then if I print the length, this should be 0 afterwards. So it should be 3 and then 0. It works. You can find more information here. So if you can just search for list from the core package, you can find a lot of the public methods and properties here. Now let's talk about the final data type that we must know about, which is maps. Map objects are surrounded by curly braces containing a list of data with each item having a key and a value. This is useful for storing values that comes with some identifier of sorts, such as employee ID mapped with employee name. Maps are basically like a key value pair. Like if you have ever worked with JSON, then you do identify that it is a map of string and dynamic. Similar to list, the type of this map will be dynamic and dynamic since no data type has been defined while creating this variable. But just like maps, we can define the data type if we want the type to be strict, such as creating a map of int and string and having no other data type allowed. So here we can have int and string. So that way, if I add a map of int and int, this should not be allowed. Let's try this. Here I'm adding int and int. Technically, this should throw a compiler error, and if you can see here, it's saying the element type int cannot be assigned to the map value string, because in the second one it is supposed to be a string, but here we are providing an integer. Now all the variables that we have defined till now were given a value, but in real world use case, sometimes this value can also be null. But if we try to reassign this variable with a null value, it will throw an error. Suppose employee list equal to null. As you can see, a value of type null cannot be assigned to a variable of type map. So does that mean none of these variables can ever hold a null value? This would be a problem because sometimes the null value is pretty important in certain cases. So obviously Dart does provide you a way to create nullable variables. If you simply add a question mark after writing the data type, so in this case here or after here, then the Dart compiler assumes that this variable can hold a value or a null object. See how the error vanished now? Like maybe for this map, you can also have a use case where the employee name can be null. So here you can add like a question mark just after string as well. So that way, not only this map can be null, but you also can have an employee list value where you can have an integer which cannot be null, but the employee name, which is a string, that can be null. So in this case, you have 2 or 003 and null. So yeah, the employee does not have a name, or we do not have the record of the employee yet. So this is also now allowed. And since Dart 2.12, all the variables defined in Dart are non-nullable by default. So the only way to make them nullable is to add this question mark during declaration. We will discover more about null safety concepts as we proceed in the course. Now that's all the data types that we need to know before starting our Flutter journey. There are obviously more types, but you can learn them as you advance in your learning. But there is also another concept that you must be aware of, which is access modifiers. Not all variables should be accessible outside of the class or method or library. In Java, we have some keywords like public, private, and protected. Dart doesn't provide those kind of keywords. Instead, you can use this underscore at the start of the name of an identifier or a data member of a class to make it private. Anyway, this gives you enough idea on data types in Dart, and now you can easily work with data for your Flutter applications.